We're going to do a short review of Visualforce pages, just kind of rehash some of the basics of our component syntax, our expression syntax. Then what we're going to do is we're going to talk about developing controllers. So we're going to talk about controllers in general, then we're going to get into the controller code, the characteristics about controller code, whether it's a custom controller or a controller extension, and the different classes that we'll be working with when we're coding our controller code. And then we're going to talk about doing things like creating wizards. We'll talk about custom components for controllers. And then we'll talk about testing our custom controller code. Okay? What we're talking about, just to review on our map of declarative and programmatic, this is going to be the business logic layer. Visualforce controllers are the business logic layer and our programmatic option within our platform. All right, so first topic, the review of Visualforce pages. So the basics of Visualforce page syntax. We create Visualforce pages, and all Visualforce pages start with the apex page tag, and they end with the closing tag for apex page. It is the equivalent of an HTML tag that you probably used within HTML pages. Your tags might have attributes which further refine their behavior within the page. Here's some example markup. So here we have our page tag with the title attribute. Comments, this being a markup language, comments are done with the angle bracket bang and then dash dash, and then closed with the dash dash angle bracket. If you do an apex comment, it's merely going to display it. So here we have our one-line apex comment. You can embed standard HTML into your Visualforce pages. So there we have our level 1 header, a self-contained tag with a slash at the end, and then all pages end with the closing tag for the page. Okay. Some basics about developing with our expression syntax and then also our tags. So here's a very common thing that you're going to be doing within your Visualforce pages. We're utilizing the input field Visualforce component. And what we've done is we've done a data binding. So you'll notice here that there is the value attribute, and the value attribute is set to this expression. Expressions are identified by the curly brace exclamation. And then what we have is in the case of using a standard controller like we're doing here, we have essentially an instance variable which is based on the name of the object. So since this is a contact page, we have an instance variable called contact. And we can use dot notation to access a field. So in this case, here we're accessing the salutation field. In most cases, what it does, it will render the appropriate web control. So in this case, the salutation is a pick list, and the label associated with that field. So whatever label that is. In addition, if we have something like a validation rule, which returns an error to a field, it also the input field contains the logic to do the red bar and to display the error message associated with that. The expression syntax follows the object.field name format. That's what we use within the standard controller. But for that matter, it can be any old variable that you define within your controller. So we'll talk about later about how you could just have some, my var, and then display, or for that matter, create an input field for the purpose of updating that field within your controller. There's also something called global variables. Global variables are identified by the $sign. There's a number of these. $user is information about the currently logged in user. $page is a reference to another Visualforce page, helpful when we're creating things like command links or output links, and we want to create a link to there. We also can do something called component binding, which allows us to bind to another element within the page using $component. When we perform a data binding expression, so much like we had in the previous example where we are displaying contact information, well, how do we know which contact record in the database to locate and populate the fields on that page? Well, in the case of the standard controller, we use the ID. So there's an HTTP query string parameter, ID, and we set this equal to the record ID of the record that we want to work with. In fact, when you're overriding something like default actions, the system will automatically do this for you and populate that when a user clicks on the edit link associated with a record. The HTTP query string parameter ID identifies the record that the page is contextual to, therefore it has the logic to go out and locate that record. There are many different types of bindings, but here are the three most common ones that you'll probably see. Data bindings, either getting or setting values up in the controller. There's action bindings, so when a user clicks on something like a command button or a command link, or for that matter, we can do some cool stuff with Ajax. What we do is we execute what's called an action method. An action method controls navigation and executes business logic. There's also component binding. This is useful for if we're doing Ajax-enabled features. One of the things that people do is partial page refreshes. So we can do something like re-render a portion of a page. The way that we would identify that portion of the page, we could do something where we can use component binding to reference that, or for that matter, any purpose we need, maybe associated with writing some JavaScript, to be able to obtain the ID of that component within the document object model. That's what we'd use the component binding for. Here's sample markup showing a Visualforce page doing a bunch of stuff. You'll see that it's using the standard controller for account, which means that we have an instance variable within the page of the same name. We're using the global variable for the currently logged in user, so we're displaying hello and then that person's name. It displays the account name value here. We have something called a page block table, and what the page block table does is it displays a table with the Salesforce look and feel. And what we're doing in this case is we're iterating over a related list of contacts. And so we can bind to the children associated with the current record using account.contacts. In this case, the var represents the iteration variable. They've called it contact, although they could have called it C or anything for that matter. But what we're doing is we're then binding for each column, displaying each column's data, and we would iterate over the list and display rows for every record. Okay. Action binding. Action binding can be used with both standard actions and custom actions. There are standard actions that exist for standard controllers. Those are view, edit, cancel, delete, save, and quick save. So there's also things like list for calling list views. But those are, when you're working with a single record, those are the 6 primary standard actions. One of the things that we're going to be doing later on is creating custom action methods within an Apex class. So by creating a custom controller or controller extension, defining our own actions and being able to call those. The great thing about Visualforce and Apex is that we get to pick and choose when we want to implement these features, depending upon whether we want a custom look and feel in certain situations. We create a Visualforce page for those cases. Or we could define or decide that we want custom behavior, in which case we'd be looking at creating a custom controller in order to implement that. So we can pick and choose how we want to implement those. What are the expressions used in pages bound to in controllers? So what are the different things that we could bind to in controllers? What's that? Sorry. Global data. So we could do the $, which bind to global values. Very good. What else? Any variable in the controller. So we can access, we can get data from the controller. We can also set it by creating input controls. And then what was the other type of binding that we were able to do? Not component binding, which is action. Exactly. Action binding, so we can execute an action method. Okay.